The people were with Andrew Jackson, but he needed more than them to get through the next 4 years. He needed a cabinet. Cabinets usually contained the best and brightest public servants. President Washington had Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. President Monroe had John Quincy Adams, arguably the best Secretary of State in American history. But Andrew Jackson was an outsider. He didn't know or like most public servants in Washington, D.C., so he brought his own people with him. For Secretary of War, he chose John Eaton, an old ally from Tennessee. For Secretary of State, he chose Martin Van Buren, a senator who helped him win New York in 1828. They weren't necessarily the best and brightest, but they were loyal to Jackson. William Lewis, Amos Kendall, Duff Green, and Andrew Donaldson also came to Washington. They weren't part of the cabinet. They were Jackson's friends he could rely on for advice. Jackson's enemies called them the Kitchen Cabinet. And then there was Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun, who also served as John Quincy Adams' vice president. He broke away from Quincy to help Jackson win the South in 1828. Calhoun still wanted to be president himself, so he figured being VP to a beloved war hero can only help his chances in the future, proving that aura farming is not a new thing. The cabinet, the kitchen cabinet, the vice president, and the people. How would President Jackson balance these forces? If you've heard Trump talk about draining the swamp,
drain the swamp, drain the swamp,
or the deep state,
radical, to dismantle the deep state and reclaim our democracy,
or getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse,
waste, fraud, abuse, waste, fraud, and abuse.
You've heard a 2000s version of Andrew Jackson. Trump spent a good portion of his first term comparing himself to Jackson.
Jackson first confronted and defied an arrogant elite. Does that sound familiar to you? I wonder why they keep talking about Trump and Jackson, Jackson and Trump. Oh, I know the feeling, Andrew.
Although in his second term, it's not clear if he even remembers Jackson's name. Jackson spent his first months in D.C. giving out jobs. Many people worked for the federal government as postmasters, printers, tax collectors, etc. Most of them had been on the job for years, serving many different presidents, until Jackson came to town. He gave out high-level government jobs to members of his kitchen cabinet, and lower-level government jobs to people who supported his election campaign. He fired many experienced federal workers to make room for them, over 900 when all was said and done. In contrast, John Quincy Adams only fired 2 government workers during his presidency. Newspapers claimed he was getting rid of qualified government workers to make room for his own lickspittles, which was technically true, but Jackson didn't care. He didn't deny it. In his mind, this was democracy in action. Cycling new people into the government was a good thing. He called it rotation in office. He thought that people who stayed in government work for too long were too set in their ways, too out of touch with the people. In fact, he didn't see government work as particularly difficult. Anyone with a pulse could do it. Why shouldn't his supporters have a chance? Governors around the country had been doing the same thing. William Marcy, the governor of New York, proudly gave jobs to his cronies. In his words, to the victor belongs the spoils, meaning whoever wins the election can hire his own people. What Jackson called rotation in office became known as the spoils system. Jackson knew Washington insiders would complain about this, and newspapers would write negative stories about it. So he helped one of his kitchen cabinet pals, Amos Kendall, get his own newspaper, the Washington Globe. The Globe would explain to the country why Jackson was always right. Kendall soon gave control of the Globe to a Kentuckian named Francis Blair, whose sharp writing served Jackson well throughout his presidency. American newspapers had been biased since colonial times, but this was the first time that a sitting president made a newspaper from scratch for the sole purpose of public relations. A wave of pro-Jackson newspapers sprang up across the country in what became the most effective propaganda campaign since the days of the American Revolution. In the 1980s and 90s, the Republican Party did something similar by gaining control of AM talk radio.
I'm sad that Billy Carter's no longer. He's a great character, and he was a nice guy. And if he were still around, we'd be the dream Democrat ticket. The dream ticket. Ted Kennedy and Billy Carter.
Right.
And the slogan would be, "You drink, I'll drive."
and eventually Fox News Channel.
These people are fighting the deep state as obstructionist Democrats like Pelosi, Schumer, and Schiff stare into the cameras and turn truth on its head. They're not real Democrats. They're demon rats. That's what I said, demon rats. And until the Republicans learn to fight like they do and go with a narrative that no one veers from, they and socialism will run amok in this country.
It's a major reason why so many older people are loyal to Trump. Their information comes from a media ecosystem where the Republicans are the heroes and everyone else is an enemy. The internet is just making the situation worse. Many of the biggest podcasters today are Republican coded, like Joe Rogan, who allowed Trump to lie on his show for 3 hours straight and then attended Trump's inauguration. Internet algorithms are designed to lock people into narrow media ecosystems. Watching one Republican-coded do-bro podcaster brings up 50 more, and soon you're watching 10 straight hours of guys with alpha jaws telling you to go to the gym, make money, call women B-words, and vote for Trump. Andrew Jackson giving out a few government jobs and getting control of a few newspapers seems quaint by comparison, but for the early 1800s, there was nothing quaint about it. Jackson wasn't just building a cult of personality, he was building a movement and giving it institutional power. He was building a modern political party. Parties had existed before, like the Republicans and the Federalists, but they were loosely organized and often disagreed with each other. Alexander Hamilton wrote a 50-page diss track against John Adams during the election of 1800, even though they were both Federalists. But Jackson's people were tightly organized. They knew there were rewards for being his ally, like a job, or votes, or access to the White House. They were all on the same team, a team that became known as the Democrats. Jackson might have been the manager of the team, but its architect was Martin Van Buren, Jackson's Secretary of State. Van Buren was a veteran of New York politics, where he did battle with his arch-rival, DeWitt Clinton, the governor who built the Erie Canal. It was during this battle that he sensed danger for the future of the United States. In 1826, a man named William Morgan was sitting in a jail cell in upstate New York when he was told someone had paid his bail. He left, got into a carriage, and screamed "murder" as the carriage pulled away. Morgan had written a book that revealed secrets of the Freemasons, the most powerful secret society of the age. Many founding fathers were Freemasons, including George Washington. The pyramid and eye on the Great Seal of the United States was lifted from Freemason symbolism. Morgan was never seen again, and his murderers were never brought to justice. People in upstate New York were outraged. It wasn't enough that the Freemasons were rich and powerful, but now they were getting away with murder. Small farmers in upstate New York organized groups to harass Freemason meetings. This was about more than Freemasonry. It was about regular folk standing up to the rich and powerful. These regular folk created their own political party, the Anti-Masonic Party, the first third party in U.S. history. A third party is a small political party that usually doesn't have the same juice as one of the major nationwide parties. The Anti-Masonics elected members of New York State's government, but they weren't going to win the presidency. When Van Buren ran for governor of New York, the Anti-Masonics supported his opponent, DeWitt Clinton. They also supported John Quincy Adams for president. Van Buren feared that anti-Masonic support for Clinton and Adams was the first step for them getting support from all the small farmers of the North. Since all the small farmers had the right to vote, and since the North had more people than the South, the North could always determine the president. From there, it wouldn't be long before a Northern president would try to end slavery, which would drive the Southern states out of the country and cause a civil war. So Van Buren wanted to build a party that could unite the regular folk of the North and the South, so that both sections would have a say over who was president. This would keep the country united. In his mind, only one man could get the support of the regular folk before Clinton and Adams hogged them all: Andrew Jackson. It's thinking like this that gave Van Buren his nickname, the Little Magician. His vision is what gave birth to the Democratic Party. Jackson rewarded him by making him Secretary of State, the traditional stepping stone to the presidency. But he would have competition, specifically Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun, who we know had been angling for the presidency for a long time. It was time for the Little Magician to work his magic. We learned that Jackson's Secretary of War was his Tennessee pal, John Eaton. John Eaton was married to a woman named Margaret. Everyone hated Margaret. She was loud, obnoxious, and had, let's say, a certain reputation that no woman wants to have. The wives of DC's other power players wanted nothing to do with her, especially Vice President Calhoun's wife, Floride. This upset Andrew Jackson. In Jackson's mind, Eaton was his friend. Margaret was Eaton's wife, and anyone who respected him should respect them. Disrespecting Margaret was like disrespecting Jackson. Plus, Jackson knew what it was like for people to say horrible things about his wife. He wasn't going to let his friend John Eaton go through the same thing. His message to the men in his White House was clear: get your wives in line and treat Margaret with respect. But that didn't happen. Everyone still hated Margaret. Floride Calhoun didn't even look at her. Jackson took this as a sign of disrespect not only from her, but from John Calhoun too. Only one person treated Margaret with respect: Martin Van Buren. As Van Buren got closer to Margaret, he got closer to Jackson, and Calhoun was shut out. So one day, Jackson and Van Buren were out riding their horses when Jackson started complaining about the Margaret Eaton situation. Van Buren had a solution. He and John Eaton would resign from the cabinet. If they resigned, Jackson could demand the rest of the cabinet resign too. It would free Jackson from the Margaret Eaton nightmare and allow him to find a cabinet more loyal to him. So Jackson took Van Buren's advice. In 1831, Jackson's entire cabinet resigned, something that had never happened before. Jackson replaced them with loyalists who caused fewer headaches. Jackson made John Eaton ambassador to Spain, getting him and Margaret out of his hair for good. He appointed Van Buren ambassador to Britain. The Senate just needed to approve him. When it came time for them to vote in February 1832, the Senate tied, and when the Senate ties, it's up to the vice president to be the tiebreaker. Now was Calhoun's chance to shine. He voted against Van Buren, rejecting his appointment as ambassador to Britain. Calhoun wasn't stupid. He knew Van Buren had been getting close to the president while shutting him out. He knew that Van Buren was angling for the presidency, just like him. He wasn't about to hand Van Buren a W by voting for him. Calhoun was so proud of his vote, he told a friend it will kill him dead. He will never kick, sir, never kick. But Calhoun celebrated a little too early. When Jackson ran for re-election in 1832, it wasn't Calhoun by his side as VP. When you look at the list of American presidents throughout history, Calhoun's name is nowhere to be found, but Van Buren's is. What happened? How did Calhoun go from being a breath away from the presidency to Nowheresville? How did he go from the guy who helped Andrew Jackson become president in 1828 to the guy Jackson threatened to hang from a tree in 1832? We will answer these questions in part 4.